The Collaborative Analytics Workstream meeting, weekly meeting. We'll be getting started shortly. We're just going to allow a few more people to join. This is a pretty big quorum, so we'll allow a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the N3C's Collaborative Analytics Workstream meeting. This meeting is being recorded. I think, Justin, we have a pretty big quorum right now. Should we go ahead and kick it off?
Yeah, let's get started.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Justin Ganay.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Collaborative Analytics weekly call. I see we're almost 2-to-1 panelists to attendees, so a lot to cover in this daily agenda. So as usual, we'll start with general updates and then talk about the process for acquiring Palantir training for the first wave and subsequent waves. We've been working to put different leaders and co-leads into various positions, and so we want to give some updates to the different subgroups and give them a chance to talk about some of the organizational work that they've been leading. We'll be able to have the Leaf demo that we initially scheduled for last week, and talk about some of the approaches to generating synthetic data. So let's go ahead and just get started here. Again, for those who may be new to this call, just to remind you that there are 4 different work streams that are operating in parallel: data partnership and governance, phenotype and data acquisition, data ingest and harmonization, and then collaborative analytics. So this call is focused on the collaborative analytics discussion. So let's move to updates. We've sent out a bulletin through the N3C CD2H weekly bulletin. Many of you may have seen this, but just wanted to give an opportunity to remind people about some of the important announcements that have been made. Melissa or Ken, if you're on this line, it'd be nice if you could just highlight what you'd like to share with the group here. Otherwise, I can walk through this. I don't know if they're capable. Are they attendees?
I'm here.
Oh, hey, Ken. If you want to provide us some updates as you, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction here.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Let's see. Most of the things you have, obviously the N3C came out Thursday or Friday last week, Thursday, and then Friday afternoon, not to get into the minutia of it, but NCATS worked with the Office of Director at NIH to be able to get a data transfer agreement This is the agreement that allows NCATS to be the signatory to accept data from institutions. And that got finished on Friday. And then at NCATS, the person who's heading this up is a woman named Lily Portilla. And Melissa has given, we're starting to now identify sites to work with on getting these contracts done. And there's already been a meeting today with one site, and a second site is being lined up as we speak. So we've already trying to work with folks to start signing up, people start bringing in the data, which is really wonderful because this is very much a rate limiting step. I don't know if Chris is on the phone, but he's all but finished getting the central IRB set up for a couple of things, not only for submitting data later on, but also for us, Chris's team, to be able to take in 3 different types of data sets to test them, a PCORI, an OMOP, and a Trinetics. I think I got that right. So we're going to start testing the ingestion process, and that's all I had to update. The data access committee is still being instantiated, so that hasn't. I don't have anything to add to that.
Great, thanks, Ken. I know that we're getting chats posted online. Connor, if you can identify anything that we need to address at this time, any questions before moving on? Okay, doesn't look like it. First of all, thanks everyone for being able to get on this webinar. We've obviously seen different changes to our calendar. We moved to the webinar format, so apologize for any confusion in terms of calendaring and scheduling for this meeting. Hopefully that we won't continue to make these changes, and I hope we didn't lose too many people as we transition to the webinar format. I'm also like to welcome Joel Saltz, who's joined the leadership group for the Collaborative Analytics work stream. Many of you likely know Joel. He's the professor and chair of the Biomedical Informatics Department at Stony Brook University. And Joel has a couple slides, a few that he'll get the chance to talk about his perspective for this work stream. So welcome, Joel.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Okay, so now we'll turn to a brief update regarding the N3C cloud platform. As many of you know, we'll be using the Palantir platform as our analytical environment hosted in the Amazon cloud. They are currently provisioning a new instance for N3C, and we expect that to be available late next week. That's as of today, their projection of when that should be ready. In the meantime, we'd like to get users trained on the system, as we are all eager to understand the Palantir environment and how we can start conceptualizing how we'll utilize it for the various subgroups and developing an overall architecture for this analytics environment. So the way we've structured it, we already have an initial wave of users, approximately 15 to 20 users who have been identified, who will be onboarded, trained, and I suspect in future iterations helping with the onboarding of future waves of users. The way how we'll be breaking out the training sessions into 2 sessions. One will be an introductory session. This is meant to be a general introduction to the platform, and that should be consumable by most users. And then they'll be followed by a second session that is a more technical deep dive for those who will be helping implement the platform, who might be power users in terms of developing models and really stress testing and developing the system. So I think many of you on this call will likely be interested in the introductory session. I suspect a subset will be interested in being on the technical component. And so the first introductory session is scheduled for this week. And again, I'm talking about the first 15, 20 users we've identified. So we'll be talking not today, but in a future session about how we will develop the second wave of users and how we can get more of you onboarded and trained. But for this first wave, I want many of you know who you are. So if you can pencil in right now, there will be some training available this Thursday. There'll be two different time slots that you can join. So information, you should expect the information to be sent out likely today, or actually more likely to be tomorrow in terms of what's expected of you and how you can sign up for one of these two time slots. And then this will be followed by the technical session that we expect to occur next week, early next week, Tuesday or Wednesday, but more information will be provided once we have more information from Palantir. But for the time being, please, for those who are part of this first wave, think about your availability on Thursday to attend one of these time slots. One thing we'll be asking is for you to download OpenVPN, which you must download, install, and we'll have ability to test the VPN because you need to have a static IP when going into this system. So our knowledge that's a requirement for the FedRAMP, FedRAMP security. Okay. So moving forward, I think it's worth thinking about this work stream in 3 phases: organizing, building, and analyzing. I think it's suffice to say, without access to the Palantir environment, we're still in the organizing phase. We're developing the subgroups, developing the leads, getting those scheduled, and thinking about the deliverables of those different subgroups. I think once we have access to the system and have a sufficient number of users trained, then we'll be moving into the building phase. And then once we have data flowing and moving into the system, I expect we'll move into the analyzing phase. So I think it's a good conceptual framework in terms of how this medium will be used and how it will likely change over time. As a reminder, we have 3 subgroups that I described last week. There's the portals and dashboards, tools and resources, and then a subgroup whose name has been changed. Last week it was called questions and examples. It's been renamed to clinical scenarios and data analytics. And we have the leads of each of these subgroups who are going to introduce themselves and describe their subgroups very shortly. But first I'd like to pass it over to Joel, who will give some thoughts about how this workstream will work and the need for subgroup interactions. Joel, if you want to take it away.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I guess this is a little bit the opposite way that I was expecting it to be announced, in the sense that I think we probably want to get into some detail about the different groups, but let me describe how I think it all should fit together. Okay, so basically, and I should say, just to start out with, we've been sort of very heads down, to put it mildly, for the last month or so in developing an all sources data commons for our part of Long Island, Stony Brook, and our network and our affiliated hospitals. So there's been a bit of trial by fire, but it's a sort of a very it's a very intense version of this that actually involves more different types of data sources, but obviously a much smaller set of data. But Long Island does actually have quite an unfortunately large COVID-19 patient population. So we have several thousand patients. We're dealing with roughly about 1,000 inpatient data points. So one of the things that we found really important, and I think is going to be really important in this group, is to motivate the development of our methods and tools and reports and dashboards and the like with clinical scenarios, which is obviously something that this is structured to do. But I felt it was important that we have a very strong cross-cutting effort, so that all 3 of the work streams are motivated by clinical scenarios. Something we found is important is creation of COVID-19 focused data elements, in some sense engineered features. Now, this isn't to say that there's not a good possibility that some very important information will emerge emerge from analysis of much broader collections of data elements. And indeed, this is really a major strength of this effort. But I do think that nailing down a modest number of carefully curated data elements is going to be important. And obviously the data harmonization groups will be doing much of this, but I think when the rubber meets the road, when we start looking at analyses and begin to replicate and extend some of the analyses that smaller groups have done, that's something that we're going to really want to look carefully at: comorbidities, laboratory values, medications, and things along those lines. Progression's obviously very important. So I suggest that potentially, rather than having individual groups, or in addition to having individual groups go through and figure out how they want to organize and model data elements to represent progression and evolution, that also an element of that be a core activity. What I mean by that is that many of the questions involve the question of how long a hospital, how length of stay of hospitalization, time to intubation, readmissions, and the like. So time is very important. And similarly, selection and configuration of tools and resources driven by clinical use cases. Let's see, next slide. I guess I don't think I can advance this. Good. Okay. So I think that the analyses, that there be a core set of analyses, at least I found from our Stony Brook work, and we have a lot of calls now with the New York area group as well, that lots of researchers have their own twists on things, but there are a core set of questions that most clinical researchers involving COVID-19 studies want to ask. And I think that data and analyses should be carefully validated and made available to the community, and then the individual groups would build on that as a base. I mean, they can validate it, they can ignore it, they can do what they want, but at least from what I've seen, there really is an important core set of questions. I think that living documents should be made available. I'll be interested to learn more about LEAF, and maybe that would be a really good tool for people who've lived in the cancer space. I see BioPortal or something like that. Basically a scenario where one can look at a high level and essentially get a very high level breakdown of the relationship between different variables. Trinetics is actually also, and I see their Trinetics folks, John is on here. That's also another tool from the standpoint of, okay, we've got nicely curated data elements, and that would be another tool that could be used by the community to look at aggregated data. Something that we've had a lot of discussions about on various calls involving the CD2H mechanism, it still seems to be a little unclear, is the linking of this data to imaging, pathology, biobank data. I think it's really important that we think through how this could be enabled so that we don't end up with a data silo, because that's a huge amount of potential usefulness. And finally, in terms of portals and dashboards, again, presenting population summaries and cohort discovery tools. So I guess I see these three work streams. It's important to have separate work streams so that we can have concurrency, but they think they need to be linked together. And these are at least a few preliminary ideas I have for how they should interrelate.
Thanks, Joel. And this slide that follows just reinforces that idea that despite the fact that we formed these separate subgroups, we emphasize that they'll be coordinating their activities because the output of one may be dependent on the input of another. And so, the intention is that there'll be a lot of cross-cutting dialogue among these different subgroups. But also importantly, they have different roles with respect to the engagement with the wider community. And I think, Joel, you already touched on some of these more specific touch points, such as the imaging community or the genomics community. I think there's opportunities to think very strategically there. But broadly speaking, the portals and dashboards needs to be the on-ramp to the general research community and access of the system and the questions that we hope the community will be able to address. The tools and resources, I think they really can provide a foundational outreach component to the tool and community groups such as Odyssey, and the clinical scenarios and data analytics for them to be able to formulate the clinical questions will obviously need to be engaged with the right domain experts, clinicians, epidemiologists, and the modeling community. So I think there's an important emphasis here as an external facing component, not only our internal interactions. So with that, I'd like to move to introduce the subgroups.
There's a question that has been posed. Do you guys want to take care of that?
If you want to just read the question.
It says, how do you propose to get a smaller set of data elements, and how will this relate to the data models feeding N3C?
A smaller set of the data elements. I don't know if that's a harmonization question, if this is about upstream data.
Was that question addressed at me, perhaps?
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah. No. The intent is, or my intent, and I said this is what something we're doing here. We're not eliminating any data. We're not getting rid of data elements, but what we're doing here, and I think it's probably a really good idea, is to define a smaller set of data elements that we can carefully curate, make sure that the harmonization is carried out in a way that makes sense from the standpoint of COVID-19. And also there's some data elements, for instance, things like ventilator settings, in intubation, where there are potential ambiguities, variables having to do with progression of disease to a large degree, ICU admission and things like that, where I think a little bit of extra care is probably needed so that what we're talking about is comparable between sites. So the notion is not to get rid of anything. The notion is for certain particularly important variables that have to do with progression and milestones and landmarks and outcomes, response to treatment, that we really make sure that those are particularly carefully vetted.
Yeah, Joel, this is Mike. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yeah.
But the N3 vision is spectacular in terms of taking the Coronet CDM and the I2B2 ontology-based models and what's out there in terms of Trinetics and other frames, and then harmonizing them into a common Odyssey-based model. And that pipeline of transforms from the source providers of data to Odyssey is tricky to say the least, but important then in understanding the issues that will relate to further trimming or further handling it. I just was thinking about more on the transforms along those three hops, from source systems to an Odyssey model to what the data analytics team was doing. I don't know if that helps reframe the question.
Right. Now, and I should say, let me just say that, so we actually do mapping to Odyssey. And so what I'm talking about, at least from our experience, is after that there are certain variables where we've had to sort of dive somewhat deeper into our group of operational people so we could really understand some relative distinctions that, at least in our implementation of Odyssey mappings, weren't necessarily made. So I mean, I think that worst case, if I'm incorrect and the standard mapping pipelines are perfect, all we have to do is say, yeah, okay, makes sense, no, nothing to do. So worst case, it's a no-op.
So this is Chris Shute. I'll speak up since I'm leading the ingestion and harmonization efforts. You're all right, of course, but I think tactically what will be done, at least initially, is to take what exists in each of the contributing sites in their common data models and harmonizing it into an OMOPS environment. You're right, Mike, that has tricky aspects to it, and we're discovering new ones every day. But that doesn't address the point Joel is making. We're all aware, since we're all involved in many of these networks in any event, that virtually all the common data model communities are making COVID extensions, COVID modifications, COVID specificity along the lines that you're describing, Joel. On day one, we are less likely to incorporate those in the early versions of the data. But as this project matures, we hope to leverage the wisdom across all the common data models and have collaborate with our participating sites in terms of prioritizing which ones they're able to deliver. For some sites, it's going to be easier than others. Some sites are implementing these changes in any event because they want it for their own common data models, for their own environments. That's what's going to require coordination. So, and it may not be a perfect coordination across the data models, which is acceptable to the extent that we can map it to a common framework for an OMOP 5.3.1 structure inside the analytic Palantir environment. Now, Joel, in terms of what you're saying, that analysts would take derivatives of that and do further refinements, of course, that's what we expect. But the vanilla starting point on Palantir, at least as it's currently projected, will be a 5.3.1 rendering of what we get from the sites.
No, it's perfect. And I think a point that if in the process of working through the analysis, there are distinctions or tweaks to mappings that are useful, we should sort of plan to have kind of a link between these two broader groups, because I agree, obviously, we don't want to continue to sort of have to do this as a special case and analysis, because it really is an OMOP mapping thing. And I'm sure you can incorporate that into your standard pipelines once we decide it's, community decides it's important.
Yeah, Joel and Chris, thank you. That's very helpful in terms of clarifications. There is a rich and growing amount of scar tissue over folks being tasked both locally and regionally to do extraordinary things with these COVID data. And I think a success factor in N3C is going to be tapping to that already, enriching scar tissue among sites that are being challenged to use the data coming out of these source systems. And so we obviously have to push as many people doing analytics to this group as we can, and that what I'm going to be supporting through my roles here. So thank you for the clarification, much appreciated.
I believe, Justin, there's another question from Hadi Karazi about, yeah.
Let me go ahead and answer that. So the question is how did you become part of the second wave of users to be trained and to gain access to the system? So that will be forthcoming. We will be describing the on-ramp for people to sign up and gain access. I suspect that will be released next week as we work through the first wave of users. So if you can be patient, we'll be providing that very soon. Okay, great questions. So now I'd like to introduce the Portal and Dashboards subgroup. This has been led by Dave Eichmann and Warren Kibbe. Dave or Warren, if you'd like to introduce yourselves and describe the subgroup.
Sure, this is Dave Eichmann. I'm at the University of Iowa. I guess from this context, I'm the director of the resource discovery core within CD2H itself. So there's a fairly natural mapping to the Portal and Dashboards activity. Warren, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. This is Warren Kibbe. I'm at Duke University. Some of you might know me either from Northwestern University, which I left a few years ago, or from the NCI, excuse me, where I was for the last 4 years. No, that's not COVID. I just swallowed some water. Oh boy. So I'm really excited to be engaged with this, and I look forward to working with all of you. And I think Joel made a really interesting remark about CBOW Portal and how we can go about creating some interesting looks into the data that we'll be tracking. Again, I think we'll see as we get a chance to look inside Palantir exactly how we'll go about building those dashboards. So looking forward to working with all of you.
All right, so most of the bullets here are mostly just identifying questions that are outstanding. Clearly, we're going to have a public entry point. I think the presumption is that it'll be some sort of portal intro page on covid.cd2h.org. I mean, some of the interesting questions here are whether or not we have a separate login for Palantir versus what I'm referring to as the DMZ, which is the shell of N3C that sits outside of the scope of Palantir. Part of what we're going to end up doing with that, particularly with respect to the dashboard questions we want to raise later, is getting from login credentials into researcher identity. And from there, knowing enough about folks that we can do things like expertise identification and so on. For those of you who are familiar with the resource discovery platforms, profiling platforms that are out there, we're probably going to be touching base with you to see whether or not we can't pull decent profiles on researchers from your home institutions so that we can provide a fairly rich environment for people to do expertise discovery in. Access, request, and approval mechanisms. Clearly, the DAC's going to have a lot of activity there. There's probably going to be a need to decide how much we do outboard with respect to this and how much we do inboard within the DMZ. The forward-facing, public-facing aspects of this, we presume we're going to want to be fairly open, if nothing more, to encourage folks and Mike's notion of deflecting local activity to us. I think it's going to be useful for people to be able to tell just what we are doing with the overall platform to encourage people to sign on and engage with us to enrich the environment. So next slide. And then once we've got activity going on, clearly we've got data being generated. We're going to have to worry about the rate at which the harmonization folks are interested in generating builds and releases. And from there, just how we end up doing summarizations. Regions, institutions, investigators are all part of that mix. Research dashboards, there are going to be derivative data sets that are going to need to be tracked and utilized in terms of how people build out pipelines. I touched on researchers and expertise in institutions from a teaming perspective, and then just overall where we go from there in terms of the general goals of being sure that we attribute contributions to the overall mix. And the contributor role ontology work that went on previous cycle within CD2H, I think is going to be very useful in that regard. Let's see. And James has got a question about GA4GH efforts for researcher identity and so forth. One of the interesting questions here is not only from an identity perspective, but also basically access, authorization, mixed kinds of questions. At this point, we don't have a really deep notion of what Palantir can allow us to see and can allow us to generate from an external configuration perspective. That's where we're going to be learning some of this stuff on the fly about as fast as folks using the system are learning it.
All right, thanks, Dave. Okay, so moving on to the next subgroup, tools and resources. Happy to introduce Chun-Li Wu and Andrew Williams, who will be leading the subgroup. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Great. This is Chun-Li Wu. I will start. Chun-Li Wu from Scripps Research. I'm associate professor there, and I'm also a side PI at the CD2H. And I'm glad to co-lead this tour group with Andrew Williams. Andrew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Andrew Williams. I'm faculty at the Institute for Clinical Research and Health Policy Studies at Tufts, and equally glad to be working on this with Chun-Li.
Great. So I guess I will go through the list of items in our mind that we should achieve in this subgroup. And I think our overall goal is make the tools and the resources ready for N3C to take actions, and how to make it possible for the for all the scenarios and queries analysis can be done in the N3C cloud infrastructure to make it work. Yeah. So first, we'd like to first the focus is to bridge the clinical use cases with the underlying tool resources. That's obviously need to coordinate with the clinical scenarios and the data analytics subgroup. And we will work with them to identify the relevant tools and the resources to answer specific clinical queries and perform the certain data analysis. And we also want to make sure those tools and the resources can be deployed to the cloud infrastructure, such as like a Palantir, so that the query and the analysis can be carried out. And the second focus is really to bridge the tools and resource community and the N3C data infrastructure, because there's a lot of existing and also parallel COVID specific or general tools and resources available out there. We want to first make sure the research community know what N3C provides by working with the portal and the dashboard subgroup as they are building a landing page entry point for the external groups, external community. And we also want to bring the external those tools into the N3C, maybe have them to try the N3C data and propose the new capacity we can enable by those tools and resources. And third one, we really want to use our example, using our capacity in the clinical data from the N3C, and also the translational knowledge source work at the NCATS translator program to really bridge these two projects, and hopefully to make it into the action and turn the data into the knowledge which has the clinical impact. And so in this focus, we plan to deploy the NCATS translated knowledge graph into the N3C infrastructure, and also set up the initial demos between the N3C data and the translated knowledge graph. And of course, both projects are ongoing and will continue to evolve. We want to coordinate the long-term interfacing between these two projects. And Andrew, feel free to add anything I missed here.
Oh, that's great.
All right, thanks, Chun-Li and Andrew. Okay, finally, the last subgroup, clinical scenarios and data analytics, being led by Peter Robinson, Heidi Spratt, and Tel Bennett.
Yeah, hi everybody. Should start. I'm Peter Robinson. I'm a site PI in CD2H at the Jackson Laboratory for Genomic Medicine. I have training in pediatrics and genetics in Germany, and also have a degree in computer science, work on bioinformatics of clinical ontologies and genomics. And Heidi, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Heidi Spratt. I am at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. I am a biostatistician with some expertise in bioinformatics, and my role largely is to ensure that the public health aspects of this are just important as the clinical. So trying to bring the community side into this as well and make sure it's not forgotten.
We additionally have a clinical co-lead, Tel Bennett from Colorado, who is a pediatric intensivist with an interest in using data science to improve clinical care. I don't think he's on the call today. Is that right? Okay, so our goal really is to enable and accelerate analysis of this data set. Briefly, a common experience of people in this field is that it takes longer to actually prepare the data and get everything set up than to do the actual analysis. And we hope to basically make that go a lot faster. So we're going to, together with the tools group that we just heard about, identify community tools for inclusion, write documentation and tutorials for people coming from different fields. We hope to work with, we will work with clinicians to identify 3 to 6 projects to basically start off with, and to make pipelines that can be more or less cloned and adapted to many other situations. The Palantir system can be conceived of as a series of nodes. It's a graph and you can put together the nodes to do your analysis. And so we would like to, with the community, plan an overall architecture so that the nodes are compatible. So that, for instance, if we have 10 nodes to do quality control, that the 10 nodes don't each have different input and output requirements, but essentially can all be plugged in the same place in a pipeline, if that's appropriate. We will work with informaticians and software engineers, and have software engineers on our team to implement some of these nodes, and we will implement several example analysis pipelines for adaptation by other groups and document those. And finally, we'll work with the portal and dashboard subgroup to ensure that the output of stuff that gets done in this subgroup, that can be displayed adequately. So thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And I would like to remind everyone that these subgroups is really where most of the hard work is going to happen. So there will be ways to onboard to these subgroups. We're really looking for people who are willing to commit time and attention to advancing the work there. And we'll be following up on this after this call with ways to get engaged and participating in those different subgroups. Okay, so we have 2 items left. We'll be talking about the synthetic data generation effort that hasn't been much discussed in this work stream, although it is a component. And so I would like the opportunity to cover that. But first, we ran out of time last week for the LEAF demo. I'd like the opportunity for the group at University of Washington to present LEAF. I think this is a really great example of the kinds of tools and resources we want to consider deploying in this cloud. People obviously of all stripes will be coming to this environment. People who are power users and NoSQL and can get their hands dirty, but we also need to provide the tools that allow people who might not have that skill set but still want to be able to study and build cohorts. I think the LEAF tool is a great example of the kinds of tools we want to consider. So Nick, if you're available and able to present. Nick Dobbins, are you available? I see Nick sitting in the attendees. So Connor, if you can make him a presenter.
Promoted him. Nick, you should be able to unmute at this point.
Yes, I can. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, thanks, Justin. So let me share my screen. Give me just a moment. Excellent. Can everyone see a web browser with a blue background right now?
Yes.
Excellent, thanks. Great, so my name is Nick. Nick Dobbins. I'm at the University of Washington. I'm the software engineering lead here in Seattle. I'm also a doctoral student at the University of Washington. And I'll do a brief demo of LEAF. Please jump in and ask questions or let me know if there are questions as I'm going if I skip over something important. I'm going to do a demo with de-identified data on the central LEAF instance at the University of Washington. So for folks seeing this for the first time, so this is the main kind of login entry screen for LEAF. After we authenticate, the first thing that LEAF asks is, what are you here for? In this case, at UW, we have identified data as well. We have multiple uses. And so I will select research and say I do not have an approved IRB, and I'll be viewing de-identified data. I think the future deployment may look a little different if we use this for COVID and so on, where we may not need to doubly de-identify patients in LEAF, but we could as well, of course. So I'm going to say I do not have an IRB, and let's de-identify that, and I will attest I'm not going to do anything bad. And all right, we've logged in. So the idea of Leaf is to kind of build on the really amazing work that's been done in the past with tools like I2B2 and others, but do so in a way that kind of updates the UI to be a little bit more modern and intuitive, and also to be flexible with the database model and architecture behind the scenes. So Leaf has been successfully deployed with the OMOP data model, with I2B2, with Epic Clarity and proprietary systems as well. And today I'll be doing a demo that uses the kind of mixed proprietary and other systems that we use at the University of Washington. So if you've seen I2B2 and other tools, the basic layout should be fairly familiar. On the left-hand side, we have kind of ontologies and hierarchies of data elements that can be dragged over to create queries on the right. So to create a very kind of simple query, we can start with, let's ask, how many people in our system, I'll go down to HMC, which is one of our hospitals, have been seen in that emergency department. So I'm just going to drag this over, and we'll say, very simple, let's just say the past 30 days, and I will run this query. If you keep your eyes kind of peeled to the top, we see that we find just under 2,000 patients in a second or so. We can get, in a click, just kind of simple visualization of that demographic data. And we can also get a patient list, kind of row level, de-identified breakdown of these patients. The default setting adds, basic demographic columns information that can be added to, of course, if we want. But before I do that, let's make a little bit more interesting query. So because Leaf is completely flexible, the items on the left can point to virtually any database table with arbitrary structure. So you can imagine cases where, as new data come in related to COVID, such as ventilator status and so on, we can flexibly and dynamically add that to Leaf. For the purposes today, though, I'll do a little bit different query just to demonstrate what we could do, though. So let's find people. So of those 2,000 or so that visited the emergency department, let's limit it to patients who have had, for example, some sort of depression-related ICD-10 code. So there's a lot of information here, but I'm going to jump down to major depressive disorder, single episode or recurrent. It's probably worth pointing out that Leaf has a kind of Google-like search interface that not only kind of suggests and does a look ahead, but also kind of lets us know what is available and things like that. So we can run this, and okay, so now we find 481 patients. That's a few less. And if we wanted to then ask, for example, of those patients, how many had a body mass index, let's say in the past 12 months, greater than 35, we could do that as well. And so we'll let this run, and okay, 42 patients. So this is a rather fast way that we can just kind of get a basic idea of the cohort. I think it's also worth pointing out that because Leaf is able to point at arbitrary data structures, this is actually live data in our data warehouse. There's no need necessarily to take down the tool during an update of data because we can point to flexible data structures. So I'm back at the patient list screen, and say we want to then ask, or I should say view the row level data for not only basic demographics, and we'll kind of hide some of these less important columns. But let's say we actually want to view that BMI data that we just searched on a moment ago. So I clicked add data. I want to view body mass index, and let's just say the past 6 months. And you'll notice that 2 new columns get added on, including a small visualization, but we can also dynamically compute statistics on these patients within that time frame that we've asked. And we can kind of add and remove columns and hide them as well. And if we wanted to, say, add even more and find out, we just queried emergency visits, so let's see those as well. We can kind of iteratively and dynamically add more and more information on these patients And right, so this is pretty interesting data, and we were able to do this in just a few clicks in just a moment. Are there any questions? I understand we don't have a ton of time, and I'm kind of zooming through. Maybe not? Okay, well, please let me know if you think of anything. So this is kind of a very high level basic introduction to Leaf. There are a number of other features I can kind of discuss how we can add data and add new items and also kind of restrict data and so on too. I'm not sure if that's of interest to the group, and I will check the chat right now. Okay, great. So any questions?
So Nick, once you have your cohort, how would you think this would integrate with the environment that we're in terms of being able to define a node within the Palantir analytic environment that others can then leverage for subsequent analysis?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question, Justin. Thank you. So I'm still learning about Palantir, as are others. I think one idea that we had was, as we save cohorts and as we save queries, and we can just click Save Query, we can add those behind the scenes. That essentially creates a unique identifier for the cohort in the Leaf database. On top of which, we could do something like create a very simple API layer where we could share those patient identifiers with others, where we could export them to a Jupyter notebook, something like that, from which more detailed and programmatic analysis could be done outside of Leaf. So there's a lot of really simple, sweet integrations we can do and build upon Leaf as well.
And we have a question regarding how this is being considered in lieu of OMOP Atlas tool. Let me first answer that in the sense that, yes, this is just an opportunity to share different tools. I think the Tools and Resources group will be evaluating this in addition to others. So I don't think any consideration for this over the Atlas tools is being made at this time. But maybe, Nick, you can take that, or even Andrew Williams, if you want to take that.
Yeah, I would just say that Leaf is designed to be modular and complementary. It's not supposed to solve every problem, but it is supposed to integrate and do a few things very well. For example, it talks directly with REDCap. It can export and import to and from REDCap. So it's not designed to reinvent the wheel. It's supposed to work well with other tools. So.
Atlas is just a much more, has a much larger scope that it tries to do. Some of the potential things that are very useful about it that are a bit distinct are its ability to feed cohorts that are defined within it into an execution engine for running against R and Python routines for analyses and additional visualizations and so forth. So and routines that get the performance characteristics of those cohorts and so forth. So there's a lot more there, but I can see the attraction of Leaf. There's a very usable, nice thing, and I'm eager to try it out. I think they're different in what they try and do to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's right. The last thing I would just mention is that Leaf is open source software. It's all on GitHub, and if sites wanted to take a closer look, we'd welcome that.
Great, thanks, Nick.
Great, yeah.
And at the end of the day, I don't think this is an either or question. We want to provide all the tools that that we think are purpose driven for different users and expertise. So great, thanks, Nick. And I don't think Albert will have time. You said you had a quick presentation, but I don't think 5 minutes will do you justice. Are you there, Albert? Okay, he may not be even present. So we'll save discussion of the synthetic data generation effort. Yeah, hello?
I wasn't, yeah, I'm here. I just wasn't part of the panel.
Oh, okay. Did you want to spend a couple of minutes, or should we save this for next week?
Okay.
Hey, Justin, so we only have like 5 minutes left. So if it's a longer discussion, so maybe we can save that for next week.
Yep, that sounds fine. Sorry, Albert. We'll have you on next week to talk about the work going on for the synthetic data generation.
Okay.
I'm trying to find my screen here for the last. Okay. Moving forward. So next steps, we'll be using this meeting to have report outs from the different subgroups. So as they've all been introduced with their co-leads, we'll be providing information on how to get access to those groups and participate. And as well for next steps, for those who are part of this first wave, again, this is approximately 15, 20 users who should know who they are. You'll be receiving information soon about what's required to prepare for the training session earmarked for Thursday. And then we'll be providing more information for the rest of you, how you can get involved in onboarding training for the second wave, which I hope we can start late next week. Okay, so any questions? I see the chat is active. I see a comment. Should we demo the Odyssey Tools Atlas at a future meeting? Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. From Mike Bisich, I don't see that's a question. Okay, any final questions?
Yeah, this is Mike. Thanks for the answer to how Leaf will be positioned in the Palantir environment. It'll be a good test case for checking out our open source codes within that very secure federal environment. I look forward to lessons learned from that particular aspect. So please share those back to the community.
Absolutely. Sam, did you have a comment? Sam Michael?
This is Nick. I'll just say we're very happy to work with everyone, and we'll do our best in deploying that and getting what we learn out of that too.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted, but yeah, the issue will be more on the compliance side, but we'll resolve that. We've deployed several open source packages within the NIH environment, and again, Leaf looks like a fantastic tool, so I think it's going to be very useful to make sure and a great use case to get this implemented.
This is Nabil from Palantir. Just to add, that was a really impressive demo. Thanks, Nick. We'll probably reach out to you separately at some point to just talk a little bit about how the data is stored and stuff like that and understand Leaf's architecture a little bit.
That sounds great.
Great. Justin, there's nothing else on the agenda, right?
That is it. Yes. So I appreciate everyone's time and attention. This is, I think, off to a great start and looking for deeper engagement as we get many of these subgroups up and running. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.